Thank you. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. My name is Salima Hashmi, as you just heard, and welcome to Savage Beauty, the Art of Imran Qureshi. I apologize in advance for my rather rasping voice. Usually it's melodious and succulent. Not today, I'm afraid. I think that the galaxy that we are proud of Pakistani artists, among that firmament, perhaps one of the most significant aspects is something that has developed over the last 2.5 to 3 decades, and that is what we call the contemporary miniature in Pakistan, or some people call it the neo-miniature. And that has been something that has been a definite Pakistani contribution to contemporary art across the world. Among the several very, very eminent artists is the name of Imran Qureshi, who is perhaps the most eminent living and working in Pakistan. If one looks back at how this came about, there are actually two strands in the teaching of the miniature as a tradition in Lahore. And although it first started at the Punjab University under the tutelage of Haji Sharif, the miniature painter who settled in Lahore after 1947, really the true movement, if we can call it that today, began with these two ustads who followed one another at NCA. The first, as I mentioned, was Haji Muhammad Sharif, who came from Patiala. And that was a very distinctive way of working in this tradition, which was paid great tribute to both the Mughal and later the late Mughal and the Punjabi hills tradition. The other strand was that came from Alwar, the small state in Rajasthan. And the ustad who came to teach at Lahore at National College of Arts was Sheikh Shujaullah. He followed after Haji Muhammad Sharif retired. And his was a very different way of teaching and looking at certain idioms, which were very much part of the tradition. Sheikh Shujaullah's prize student was Ustad Bashir Ahmed as he was then known, who then became an eminent teacher in his own right. Haji Sharif had two equally eminent students. One of them was Jamil Naqsh, and the other was Zahur al-Akhlaq. So, with Sheikh Shujaullah's retirement, Bashir took over, and he was passionate about what became one of the specializations in the fine art department at NCA. And that is how one young Imran Qureshi came to be part of first of NCA, but if I seem to remember, he didn't quite start out with something in his mind which was to be a miniature painter. Haven't said anything about Imran's eminent career. You will hear about it as you watch the images that he's going to show. But I would like to say that he was recognized this year by the government of Pakistan with the Sitara Imtiaz in painting. And as I recall, a young student who joined NCA way back, Imran, I'd like you to talk about, it's a cliche, but still, I'd like you to talk about how you started.
I know what I have to say on this. Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. So when I came to Lahore in 1990 to study art at NCA, and I was coming from Hyderabad, Sindh, so my exposure towards art was totally different what I experienced over here in Pakistan, at NCA. So I remember my first class of drawing, which was with Mrs. Salima Hashmi, and she, and it was about still life, and I had a different idea about the still life. And when we came to studio, so there were the piles of broken chairs in the middle of the studio.
I'm hated for that. I'm hated and famous for that pile of chairs.
With a lot of challenges in it. And everyone went to the stationery shop, we called him Butt Stationery Shop, and brought a very nice, clean, white sheet of drawing. And I was just looking at it, and I was somehow connecting that piles with the demonstration and agitation and violence happening in Hyderabad and Karachi in those days. So I brought a piece of newspaper with a lot of news about Karachi and curfew in Hyderabad and incidents of violence all over the city. And I draw those chairs at the top of it, and I submitted that drawing. And then after a few hours, somebody called me that Mrs. Hashmi is calling you, and I got, she's going to take my class now, actually. And she was really, she asked me why I did it, and then I replied to her about the background of my journey to Lahore and about that drawing. So she really appreciated it, and that changed the idea about the making a drawing in drawing studio in first year. And later on, I went in third year, I chose painting as my major subject and miniature painting as my, no, and printmaking as my elective. And Bashir Saab used to call me that, no, you should come to miniature department. And he was always calling me, and I stopped passing through his studio, and I was going from a longer route to my painting studio. And I was totally avoiding him. But then I was thinking that if a teacher is saying so many times to me that you should do miniature, I should take it seriously. And I had a discussion with myself, and I was thinking about it. And then I decided to move to miniature studio. And because I took it as a challenge that I don't want to do the routine practice of reproducing historic miniature painting, and I will do something which where I can express myself as an independent and free artist. So that was the day when I switched to miniature department. And so after graduation, I was looking at the idea of what contemporary miniature painting is all about. And I was looking at the idea of a single standing figure in so many hundreds of miniature paintings, especially in Lahore Museum and everywhere. So I was looking at it, but then I was saying, no, it is not about this. It has a different, so I was just trying to get the sensibility of miniature painting in my art practice through different materials and surfaces and ideas. So, for example, this was in 1995, and it's called Musawwir Ka Chota Bhai. And it's a single standing figure, my younger brother. So it's a single standing figure standing in a landscape. I was looking at the body posture, how they were using it. I was dealing with the idea of time as well, because he's wearing the costumes from 70s.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Bell bottoms.
Bell bottom, which was not about that time period, but about
90s.
something between the Mughal era and the time which we are passing through. So, and then I was going to Lahore Museum a lot. Can we fix it a little bit? So I was going to Lahore Museum a lot and looking at the landscape over there, Basuli Hill, and idea of miniature, the idea of narrative in it. So the figure has multiple meanings. It was not just the standing figure. I remember there's a painting in Fakir Khana Museum where the colors tells the weather of that image that it was done. They were depicting the really, really hot weather of June, where a lady is singing a certain rag, which is for the summer, and the heat and the light of the painting was totally different. So I was also trying to uh, bring out that kind of narrative with with the paintings which I was making about the contemporary figures. This is called Mushtari Hoshiar Bash, Beware the Buyers. And it was a comment on a historic miniature painting where Jahangir is impressing Shah Abbas.
Yes.
And they are standing on the loin and gourd. They both
Yes.
are smiling and they are just, it was showing, it was a very political kind of, and very diplomat kind of statement. So I chose two figures from NCA where I was teaching at that time. And they were just standing in the same posture as Jahangir and Shah Abbas, and something else is happening on the other side of the landscape. And I replaced the figure with this nuclear warhead in the middle of same frame. The images was getting more freer and more abstract as well at the same time. So there is a strong narrative, there are carefully drawn images, but then there is an abstract mark making around the surface. I was trying different kind of surfaces. The tapes paper tapes which we were pasting on the edges of our Vasli paper. So usually all the artists were hiding them, but I was really fascinated by these mark making and the process of miniature painting. So I was making them as a strong part of my imagery. So these two opposite things were always working in my work. The carefully drawn images and abstract mark making, or the idea of life or death, or beauty or violence. So this was always
and
there.
I also remember you made a wonderful puppet presentation, which was about the nuclear bomb at NCA.
Yeah.
You know, in the atom, you made a puppet which was an atom, which flew around. So
And the visual was very beautiful. I mean,
yes, it was.
but I was talking about the war and the after effect of war.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, surface as a content.
Yeah. I think the fact that the surface, paying attention to the surface when, as a miniature painter, you prepare the surface with such meticulous care, and you polish it and polish it and polish it and burnish it and burnish it till it becomes like silk or like marble. But then to think about doing otherwise with that surface is something that happened with your work.
Yeah. So I was going a lot to Sunday market, where you see a lot of, in Anarkali, a lot of bookshops are on the footpath. And I was fascinated by these old books. And some of the books were really interesting, and I was just buying them and keeping them in my studio. So there was a book of tailoring manuals, and it was probably, date was not mentioned. It was, all instructions were in Urdu, but all dresses were somehow connecting with the Western dresses. And there was this, you can sense the colonial time period in that book as well.
Yeah.
So I found them very interesting, very powerful chapters in that book, and I used them as a surface.
I remember one was to do with how to make a pantaloon.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't mention it, but there was also one that taught you how to make a brassiere.
I'm going to show you.
Okay, good.
So this is called Top Khana Military Patloon Kaatne Ka Tarika. So these headings are actually heading of the main captions of those whatever costume they were showing. So how to cut an artillery pantaloon. So I was very, the text and the heading was already very loaded, and it was very difficult decision what to paint at the top of such a loaded surface. So, but I was trying to keep a balance between my painted imagery and the imagery which was already there. Yeah. Topkhana patloon ka samna kaatne ka tarika. How to cut front of an artillery pantaloon. There are extra pockets in military pantaloon than the civilian one.
There have to be extra pockets in a military pantaloon, definitely.
How to cut front of a burqa. And it was the time when the 9/11 was happening, and there was a war in Afghanistan, so everyone was talking about burqa as well. So the context was totally different for me. How to cut a bra?
Yeah.
Body काटने का तरीका. How to cut an English pantaloon without belt? How to cut an American pantaloon with belt? And this was a book from a textbook. Excuse me, can you please see this? ये कट रहा है मेरे ऊपर. So this was a grammar book, and it has like he will be playing, will he be playing, they will be playing, and then I painted my own imagery. And there was the idea of mapping as well, because at the time of 9/11, everyone was talking about the mapping, boundaries, and interference of other people into your boundaries.
Yeah. And military interventions, especially in our area.
Yeah. So I was looking at the idea of map as well. So on the left side, you can see map with the dotted, targeted points, and the lines, and the idea of tree, which is usually you see this kind of foliage in Basuli Hill miniatures and Pahadi miniatures, but here I am using, they were getting more free in my imagery, and very strong part of my work as well. Easy cutting. Again, I was drawing these kind of lines from map. And this was the time when I recently traveled to UK as well. And that was my first time I was traveling into some Western country. And the idea of map was totally different. Everybody was, even if you have to go to next street, they were looking at the map and telling you. And if I go myself, it was very easy. But when they were telling me in the map, I was getting really, I was panicking. So I was fascinated by this idea of map and use of map, and how it was important at the time of 9/11. So these kind of lines, which we were drawing at the edge of, in our miniature painting when we were making borders, but we were trying the tool which is called liner at the edge of the paper. So I was bringing it inside my imagery, and the liner, I was using them in contrast to these foliage. Easy cutting again. U-turns. There were a lot of U-turns at that time as well. Mapping terrains. So I was using red, blue, and white color, which was referring to the color from American flag.
Yeah, the American flag.
And then I was, when I started miniature painting at NCA, the first exercise in the department was, it was very academic, very strict kind of disciplined, very, very disciplined exercise. And you have to draw a grid of 1 by 1 inches, and you have to draw very fine lines with the same intensity, which is really hard to do. So you have to fill the whole grid with these very fine, narrow lines all over the surface. And later on, I was thinking that the beginning of that traditional practice was with such a modern exercise. And I was really inspired by this idea. And I started looking back to the same idea and bringing it back into my work. And this is called in between. There are two the columns of grid, and there's my personal imagery stuck between two.
Between it, yeah.
This is the same series. Foundations. So this kind of idea is also commenting on teaching miniature and idea of learning miniature. How you are teaching it and what you are learning out of it. Portrait series, again the idea of book and old paper, materials, and these are more like a personal kind of narrative, because the oval shape for me is representing people or portraits. Figure versus figure. Again, I was looking at the figure, as I explained earlier, And this is a series called Moderate Enlightenment. So after 9/11, everyone was looking at the religious people in a totally different way. And there was a big segregation between the religious people who were interested in religion and the other people.
Yeah.
So I started painting them, and these people, he was one of our student at NCA. He used to play guitar, and he was a good performer as well, and he was doing one wheeling. But he has a long beard, so everybody was making fun of him that, look at the mullah, he's doing sculpture. Look at the mullah, he's playing guitar. So I was thinking that there's a big, huge problem.
It's a kind of a reverse stereotyping.
Yeah.
That you sort of already have to stereotype you and discover that it doesn't really ring true when you're talking about it.
And then he's wearing camouflage socks. If I would be wearing it, so it's a fashion statement. But if he's wearing, it's something threatening to others. And he's just doing a normal activity, blowing bubbles.
Blowing bubbles.
Yeah, and there are dragonflies.
I remember this work and people's reaction to this work, that there was a sense of amusement about it. And I think there is, in this series that you've done, there is, your humor is there. But you're also not laughing at these people, but you're laughing at people who are laughing at them. So I think that this was something that was quite endearing about this series, because the vulnerability of people who have beliefs was something that came about, and that's not something that people usually comment on.
Yeah, so the dragonflies were, for me, was idea of freedom, and they are freely nature, freely moving in space. This is again the same series, Moderate Enlightenment. So he's lying in a landscape, writing a love letter to his beloved. But the page drawn, which is a very tiny page in actual painting, this is almost like 4 by 6 inches big. So the page is from the English notebook. So showing that he's a well-educated person. Yes, and he knows English, although he's a mullah. So. And wearing camouflage socks, looking at the couple there are 2 dragonflies in a very, in a different mood, and he's just staring at them. And if you see the landscape at the top, it's been cut, and it's slightly off. So I was looking at old miniatures where there were intervention from different time periods in one painting, and you can see those. There's a figure, and then on other side, they added something else into that narrative. So it was same how the other countries and other powerful people were interfering into your boundaries, into your country. So I just try to create that kind of line in the middle. So he's doing workout. Changing shirt. So these are very normal, common acts, but they look, you read them in a totally different way.
Yeah.
So it's a diptych. He's looking at on the other side, and there's a girl on the other side. And this figure, so...
This is quite a break then. And this is quite a break in your work, and it just takes a very different pathway.
Yeah.
And it became, as a result of something that shook all of us, an incident. We'd like to sort of talk about that.
Yeah, this was 2010, I think. Yeah, this was 2010 when there was this mob killing of 2 innocent brothers in Sialkot. And so the incident was so horrific, and everybody got really disturbed. And so I thought this is the end of the society, and I mean, it's all dark ahead. But the way people responded to that event was really, that gives a hope that a lot of people, which I never thought they were on the roads, they were raising their voices against them, all TV channels, everyone was talking about it. And I saw a few-second clip of that video, and I was really disturbed, and I couldn't sleep for a few days. So one night I went to my studio and took impressions, because I saw the image of a body hanging upside down, and it was bleeding. So I went into my studio, I used the color and took impression of my own body and created this work which is called All Are the Color of My Heart. Coming from Fez Port, English translation of Faiz Sahab, poetry by
Shoaib's
Shoaib.
translation of
Yeah.
Faiz's Rang Hai Dil Ka Mere.
Yeah. So there's a hope as well from the blood of those brothers killing, how the people were responding. That was the hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it's interesting that these body parts, which are made of, there's blood, there's mass, but then they begin to blossom, and the surface is really filled with flowers. So there is a dialogue between the destruction of the body and the body coming to life again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the detail of the body.
I remember that Aisha, your wife, was very disturbed because you disappeared inside the studio for several days.
Yeah.
And she was worried about what was happening. But at the end of it, these series of works came about. Okay, so we're now talking about space. From surface, we move to space. And I think this was another turning point in your practice where the surface becomes a three-dimensional space. And I seem to remember the first time you did something was, in fact, in Delhi. Modi Nagar. And it was, I think, a tiled floor, and you worked on top of it. And I remember there was a bit of an astonishment, as because they were expecting you to do something quite different.
Yeah.
And so you surprised them by actually using the floor as your surface and working on that. And I think that began then your interventions into architectural space. That's how it happened. And possibly one of the most ambitious was the work that you did in Kabul for Turquoise Mountain, which was working in Babur's palace.
Yeah.
And so that is something which I remember when we saw photographs of that, it was moving to see how people responded after such a prolonged period of violence and war and conflict, to have a public space in which people could come in. And the fact that artists had worked in that space, I think, lent it a very special message, with artists becoming almost the ambassadors of life starting again.
Yeah. So this was Queen's Palace in Bagh-e-Babur, and this was Kabul 2007. And they just reopened this after a huge renovation project. So they reopened this palace, and with the contemporary art exhibition, there were artists from Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. So the being in a war zone, traveling there, coming back, doing site visits, and thinking about it was totally different experience for me. So I remember when I went to this, they wanted me to do something in some other space, but when I came to this hall, there was strong projection of lights coming from those doors on the floor. And I was really fascinated by them because they were so, the presence was so much strong. So I was unable to ignore them. So I decided to, what I did, I masked each window at different time of the day. The way the projection was there, I was masking it. And then after 30 minutes, I was masking the second window after 30 minutes. So each shadow was growing slowly. And then I painted like there is a stained glass on the door, but actually when you see there is nothing. So it's all about it. The piece is called Time Changes, and it's about the illusion of, there was a lot of illusion when I was in Kabul because they were saying that they are building up roads, a lot of infrastructure, but I was feeling like that it doesn't look permanent kind of thing to me. So there was an uncertainty.
Yeah.
And so I try to capture that idea into this piece. This is again the detail of the same piece. And this was Sharjah in the Baitul Circle, Baitul Circle. So, yeah, so you visited that.
Yes, I visited, and I remember when I came upon it, because you come into this very traditional heritage building, and you come into the courtyard, you know, expecting something else. And for a moment you are struck and horrified and wonder how you have come upon this place, which it looks like the site of carnage. And you know, you have a flashback, because that's what happened to me, because I just come from Lahore, where there had been this carnage in mosques. And here I was, you know, in so-called safe Sharjah Biennale, and there's the same thing happening on the floor. But you come closer to it. You come closer to it, and there is a transformation that happens. It's not carnage. It is the appearance of flowers. It's the appearance of blossoms.
Yeah, I think first time I realized that how the way people responded to this piece was such a big learning for me. People were actually crying, they were sitting there, they were coming again and again. And so then I first time realized how an artwork can work actually, and it can affect you.
No, I remember it certainly affected me. Because, you know, we are seeing a reoccurrence of things like this. And you look at the artist's desire to be a healer, and how tough that is, how difficult it is, how challenging it is for the artist to play that role of being a healer, of being a messiah, of bringing life back, of bringing hope back.
Yeah, and I think there were people who were visiting were from different part of the world, and everybody was relating it with themselves. The European had a strong connection with the World War and this piece and them. And there was a Japanese lady, she was actually crying there. And she was relating it with the tsunami which just happened over there. Arabs had they just had the Arab Spring. And so everyone has their own connection with this piece. This is the detail. Again, so for me, in site-specific pieces, which I do, where I respond to architecture, I think the imagery is same, the way of working is same, but it's the context totally changes and the concept totally changes because of the presence of that architecture, because of the history of that architecture, and because of so many other things. So it's a two-way dialogue between my work and the architecture of that space. So I was going back to the making small miniatures after doing such a huge scale.
Why did you go back to the?
There were multiple reasoning. One was that when I was trained as a miniature painter, a lot of people were saying, and I was doing other stuff. So people think that you will lose the skills of making a miniature after doing such work, after doing a messy work. So I was going back to the tradition of miniature painting to see what I have lost in this journey and what I have gained in this journey. And I was realizing that I was learning so much new things which were coming into my traditional practice of miniature painting. That was totally changing my idea of making a miniature. And usually I start a miniature from one point. I never draw an image with pencil, which is the traditional way of making a miniature. So usually people are drawing, making a drawing, then they were filling it up with the colors, and they were finishing it. So it's more like a labor work for so many days for them. But for me, I started off with one point, and I built up the story, built up the narrative around that one mark. And it keeps changing. And at the end, there are a lot of surprises in the whole journey.
I think also people are hung up on this idea of skill being something that which keeps you glued to a surface, and you do the same repetitive way of working. I think the notion that skill is a far deeper and more diverse, thing that you have, and perhaps you gained much more when you moved away from the small size, the page, the scale altered, the fact that you are intervening in architectural space, all of that was adding to your skills, as it were.
Yeah. This is opening words of this new scripture. This is Sydney Biennial. This was the artwork at the...
This actually was quite intriguing because I found it to be quite a stark and very sort of grey area in which you were working.
It was very much grey because this was the island called Cockatoo Island, and they were using it for transporting warheads and like lot of stuff for at the time of World War.
At the World War,
yeah.
okay.
So this was the ramp, and the ships were there at that, and they were just transporting. So I just responded to the these marks which were already there. This is Metropolitan Museum, and it's a rooftop.
The rooftop.
Yeah.
So this was the famous rooftop in which Bono came and lay down beside you, right? Okay.
So this is called "And How Many Rains Must Fall Before the Stains Are Washed Clean." And when I was going to do this installation, actually the curator saw my work at Sharjah, and she invited me. Sheena was the curator, and she invited me to do this installation. And when I was packing up my stuff, there was this Boston blast which happened
in the marathon.
In a marathon.
Yeah.
And there was news coming on TV, and they were talking about the finishing line. And so I was confused. The museum was also confused whether to do this work at that time period or not. And then I was completely, the one sentence was stuck in my mind, which was the finishing line. And even when I was painting it, the rooftop, just before it was finishing, I created a finishing line over there. So people who were coming on this installation and they were walking on it, they were hesitating to walk on it, and when they start walking on it, they were getting comfortable after some time. And when they were coming to the edge of this installation, so they were not comfortable with the idea of cleaner space. And this is how we were tuned into this idea that there were a lot of bomb blasts which were happening here as well. And when there was nothing happening for 2 months, we were thinking there is nothing happening. Like we were just getting slightly uncomfortable as well. So I was just talking about that. And this is again the miniature. This was East Lansing, and when I was working, it was city center, and the work was commissioned by the Broad Museum in East Lansing, and they asked me to do something in the middle of the city. And it was very challenging because a lot of traffic was passing through. People were there, and they were keep asking me. So I had different kind of challenges while I was creating this installation. So this is one of the portion of, it's called fragmented. So there were fragments of my drawings all over the city, in different part of the city. So this was one of the piece where I saw an ambulance was just standing over there. And next day I saw some truck just went on the wet painting, and they left the marks. So accidents were always exciting thing for me.
Yeah.
And they were bringing something new into my imagery. And I created this, So you can see that the tires they had lifted up the foliage, and they placed them somewhere else. This is Toronto Aga Khan Museum of Islamic Art. And they asked me to do some installation in the garden, and they were asking me how many red colors you want. So I said, hey, hold on. And I was unable to connect my imagery, red, bloody kind of imagery with Toronto. And I saw this beautiful garden with the 5 reflecting ponds, and I created another garden inside that garden. So I was talking more about the global warming, and because this part of the world is really affected by global warming, and there's I really had sunburn while I was painting it.
One doesn't connect sunburn with Toronto somehow, but...
No, I still have the marks.
Okay.
So this is called Garden Within a Garden. These are my son.
I see.
They were enjoying the installation. And then I created miniatures after the show.
So there's been this back and forth between a wider, larger space and then sort of gathering it inwards and becoming filtered into a smaller image.
Yeah. This is the basement of Museum of Modern Art in Aalborg. They, after so many years, they closed down the museum for renovation and they reopened the museum with my exhibition. So this was one of the work in the basement of the museum because actually when they opened it up years ago, first time, it was all flooding in the basement, and it destroyed a lot of artwork and artifacts over there. So I was recalling the history at the second opening of the museum by creating this piece. It's called Leakages, and there are leakages coming inside.
Coming down the walls.
Coming down the walls, yeah. This is another piece called Garden Within a Garden. It was in Bradford.
Yeah.
And the garden was a Mughal garden, inspired by they called it Mughal garden. It was inspired by the Mughal garden, but the ornamentation was missing over there. So I tried to create my own ornamentation. And the water, instead of blue, it was all black because they painted the water channels with black paint. So the black color came into my work because of that.
So it kind of spilled over into the... You need to go a bit faster.
Yeah. This is Alan, Oasis Garden. The again miniatures about that. This is Bradford City Center. I was making a comment. I was responding to the water ponds in this area, in the city center. And then I took the images of Sharjah Biennial. Somehow I wanted to bring Sharjah courtyard to Lahore. And I reprinted it on sheets of paper and crumbled them and made a huge mountain of the courtyard inside the National College of Arts gallery space.
It was quite unexpected to see a mountain of paper in the gallery, because you walked in expecting Imran to be up on the walls, and he wasn't. And there was this sort of mountain of paper, which was rustling actually. So it was a very gentle sound also that you saw in this. But it was also deeply sad for some reason. And I think it came from the initial impetus, which was to talk about something very sad and very tragic.
Because the piece is called "And They Still Seek Traces of Blood." Because when some incident of violence happened, these are the common people who are affected with it.
Yes.
And when something happened, the institution asked people to stay away from that area, and they do the investigation. So nobody knows what the stories are behind those, the reasons and everything. So here people can actually touch these blood samples and they can explore them, they can have their own narrative, they can have their own investigation. So it is quite interactive kind of piece. And when it traveled to Berlin, it just slightly changed, the scale was changed, and the placement and everything was changed. Then it went to Broad Museum in the architecture of Zaha Hadid. So I tried to made a dialogue with the Zaha Hadid architecture, where the walls were inclined toward other side of the building. So I made the mountain in this way that it was just pushing. Mountain is made up of paper, and the wall was of concrete. But the paper, when it comes into such a big number, it becomes more powerful than the concrete wall. And it's just, so there is a gravity in it, and people can walk through that narrow space underneath. This is Icon Gallery, Birmingham. This is a library, and I did this piece for one night for the New Blanche show. And the books were about the law.
It's a static thing, but actually when you're encountering it, it seems as though it's moving.
Yeah.
And moving in a rather violent manner.
This is again, I created a horizon. This is Antwerp, Mocha Museum of Modern Art. This is Kunstner Museum of Modern Art in Aalborg. Here I played with the scale, really large scale, and the scale was totally different.
Yes,
This was in a church where I used the Aga Khan Museum of Islamic Arts installation and brought it into the church. The idea of garden in religion. So I was commenting on that. And it came to Lahore again
to Lahore as
in
part
this
of
form.
as part of the Biennale. Somehow the paper was compressed,
Yeah,
and it became a brick,
brick. And it was at
and
the
the brick was in, a brick kiln.
So
together
Aisha
with
Khalid,
other-
she curated this show, and it was her studio project. And then I was looking at the idea of, I was taking landscape as main subject of my painting. So I created these landscape, it looks very beautiful, but then there is something threatening, something disturbing happening in it.
I mean, when you think of it in the miniature, the landscape is actually quite incidental.
Yeah.
And it is not the point of the painting, which is not so, of course, in landscape painting, in which the landscape is the point of it. But the fact that you have studied and stressed the notion of the landscape to make it have multiple meanings, I think that is something that has been very much there in your work, and it's altered over the period of time, but it's been very significant.
You move, sorry. आप उधर से करेंगे वापस जाएं और yes so canvas पे जब मैं when I was doing installation in on the site it's very busy space and when I was reading each and every mark it's so poetic the line the edge so I try to capture that idea because after the exhibition they just washed off my installation after a few months. And I wanted to preserve that idea on large scale canvases. So I was doing the same kind of mark making on canvas.
So it's a kind of shift of the surface.
Going deep. And here I use my own body to create this mark making on the surface.
And I see that there are these gradations of tone and color.
It is, I was commenting, I was just looking at the idea of doing gradation in miniature painting from dark to light color and blending it into another color. So I was just looking at it in a different way. This is the detail.
And I'm thinking, as I see this, because this is closer to us in time, I'm thinking about the fact that the mark making is becoming more savage and more intense. And like this one, because it is as though, as though a body has been dragged. And I think you told me that this actually is
a reference. Because there was this, I saw a video of a dancing girl in a wedding and somebody killed her in the wedding in Indian Punjab. And to clean up the space, they dragged out the body from that space. And the impression of her blood was on the floor. And they were totally different from how I was thinking before about the body in my blood splashes. So I was just referring to that idea.
And because when I see this, I'm very much reminded of the line by Faiz, "Kahin nahi, kahin bhi nahi hai lahu ka surah." And this is sort of, Malini has also worked from the same title. And I think
title of these works
and the
are
same.
also,
You have also worked from the same title.
When I thought of you, you were not there.
Yeah.
These are two drawings I did in space. This is again. The plastic was from my studio where I was trying to make not dirty my studio floor. So I was painting on the plastic sheet, and there were a lot of mark making going on the plastic, and those were done unconsciously. So I was thinking on the canvas, I'm more conscious of composition and other things.
Of course.
But there it was just happening.
And
So,
just accidental
yeah, so I
almost.
started saving them and I was traveling with them and I was doing some performance as an extension of my own body in this space. So these were more sculptural forms which were for a few seconds and then they disappeared. And then the same idea came into these drawings. This is Brent Biennial 2 years ago. And this is Ealing Road Library in London. This is a video piece about the material itself, about the idea of use of gold leaf in miniature painting, how it is alive before we apply it on this vasli and paste it on the vasli. So I wanted to preserve that movement when
because
we were.
It's so difficult to lift that piece of,
Exactly.
delicate piece of gold.
So this is, the video is about that. It's a super slow motion video of a gold leaf flying in a space.
Yeah.
And then these are called Fabric of Heaven. These are again the idea of portrait, which was changed in terms of its scale and content as well. So these black marks, I was referring to the idea of rendering an image in miniature painting and by throwing the paint in a very aggressive way. But the result is very calm and how I am creating a tonal gradation. It is totally different way of achieving the same idea.
Because I think that during the process of working, you go through different stages.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of violent, sort of physical action, and then you restrain yourself, and then you bring things together in a more design form, as though you have removed yourself almost emotionally from the first phase, and, taken to changing the mood of the work.
This is one of the most recent work. I haven't exhibited it yet.
Yeah.
It's going to some show. This is again, I'm looking at the idea of landscape in a different way.
I remember for those of you who visited the Biennale that time, the first one, there was this work which was actually quite stunning because in the Summer Palace you don't expect firstly this kind of light and then this infinity which seems to be a carpet of vegetation which goes off into infinity.
So it's very seductive, it looks so beautiful with the millions of LED lights.
Yeah.
But it's all plastic and electricity in it.
Right.
So it's just changing the idea of landscape and how we are creating artificial ways of.
I think this use of materials that people don't consider artistic, like plastics, you have used them in your work.
This is Islamabad Airport.
This is Islamabad Airport, yes, for those of us who have looked up.
So they wanted to have some Islamic calligraphy in it. It's 200 feet long and 12 feet high. And it was very challenging, the scale of the mural. And for me, using Islamic calligraphy in my painting was a bit challenging. So I used the Surah Qadr, which is about the idea of traveling in it. And so it's there, and the mark making, the painted marks are about you can see a kind of energy in it and how they are moving on canvas. So I responded to that. I connected it with the idea of traveling from airport to another place. This is National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and I use this blue color to depict the idea of purifying yourself when you go to these religious spaces and coming out of it.
We have just 5 minutes more.
5 minutes?
5 minutes more. This is plastic.
This is plastic.
Which I found very difficult to believe. But
this is called Day and Night Sang Together, a song. So it's again from the poetry of Fez. And this was the fort, and this was the platform. You can see a small platform over there.
Yeah.
So this was the place where they were keeping their during the war, they were keeping their oil and petrol for the vehicles going for the tanks and other vehicles going for the war. So I recreate this idea by having this plantation in black color.
Black.
And I was also commenting on global warming. This is a collaboration with Christian Louboutin for his retrospective show. So I used his shoe and I commented that because it was the time when the Kashmir, the Article 370 was removed from the Kashmir, and how the world was responding to that thing. They were more interested into the economy and different things than the pain of the people of Kashmiris and the other things. So I use this shoe which is covered with gold leaf. Again, gold leaf is very fragile. It's coming off the shoe as well. And it's just lying over there that somebody just threw away the shoe and ran away from a place where some incident happened. And this is the most recent work.
This is the most recent work which many people may have seen, which is Imran's collaboration with cricket. He's cricket mad. And
we can see a short video. It's 2 minutes. Video 3, clip 3.
Are we finding it?
Yeah.
Okay. So on that unusual note, but I think an important note, how the artist is observer, commenter, as well as communicator. That is his role or her role in society at large, and we're extremely grateful that we have artists like Imran Qureshi who comment on their time, look at their time very deeply, and involve us in what we should do, and that is to care about the world in which we live. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Imran, for being there and bringing joy and deep thought to all of us. Thank you. Imran didn't want to have the question and answer session, but he promised that he'll hang around so that if people want to ask questions, it'll be a one-to-one conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending.